Hello and welcome to Noble Mind.
Noble Mind is a podcast exploring mindfulness, meditation, and psychology.
Hello, listeners. In this episode, we speak with Rochelle Jaffe about working with self-criticism, emotional and physical pain, overwhelm, and anger. Rochelle Jaffe is a mindfulness and self-compassion practitioner and psychotherapist in Ashland, Oregon. She works with individuals and groups online and in person.
If you enjoy our show, we'd love for you to follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, or Twitter. And come join our free Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/nobleminded. And as always, you can learn about upcoming events, get our show notes, and join our email list at noblemindpodcast.com. We hope you enjoy the show.
We are here with Rochelle Jaffe. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Welcome.
And why don't we get us started by maybe telling us a little bit about who you are and what your background's like?
Okay. Well, hello, Alex and Kate. I started on this path in psychology, and specifically somatic psychology, with an interest in how the body is impacted and how the body expresses what's happened to us, our traumas, our positive experiences, and so on. And with the belief that it's only in the body, like if we include the body in our psychological work, that real change starts to happen. Mm-hmm. And when I got out, I got my first job, and my first job was in a pain clinic. And in that pain clinic, I would work with people. I used biofeedback. I used various different kinds of techniques. And I felt like I wasn't meeting the level of suffering that I was encountering. And so I really started to look for alternatives. I started to look at the research, and I heard about the Mindfulness-Based stress reduction program. So in 1998, I got training in mindfulness-based stress reduction, and I brought it back to the clinic. And I must tell you, like, if you can picture this clinic, mostly because I live in a small town in Southern Oregon, is mostly serving loggers and mill workers. So it's these great big guys who, like, if you started to talk to them about meditation and junk zen and some of the things that some of us are very familiar with, they would have just been really turned off. Mm-hmm. So, but what I discovered is that I could go to them and I could talk to them about what their experience was, and understanding, let them know that I really understood what their experience was like, what it was to wake up in the morning and just like have that one moment of going, a new day, and then movement, and oh God, that's right. Mm-hmm. You know, I have this terrible pain. And so we started to work with the Mindfulness-Based stress reduction program. I changed the language somewhat. And I had some really sweet experiences. Sometimes I would work with individuals, and when we would start to settle in together and start to practice what, you know, the three of us would call meditation, I would end, and there would be this moment of silence. And then often these guys are really big, right? So these really big guys would be sitting there in this chair, and they would say in these really soft voices, I always knew that this was it. Mm-hmm. I always knew that this was it. But they didn't know how to apply it. And it was so touching. And then another experience that was so sweet is one time I got them outside doing a walking meditation. And at first they thought it was really ridiculous. And then I was called away. And when I came back, they were all standing in a circle and they were all laughing and they looked so happy. And I went up to them and they said, we figured it out. This is why we smoke.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Because when we smoke, we stop, we go outside, we stand together, and we take deep breaths, and we slowly let it out. Just the same thing you're teaching us. And that was a point where they really related. And then the third thing that I was thinking about was that at one point they sent, the clinic that I worked at sent a questionnaire to the last 5 years worth of patients who'd been through their whole program. And their program included surgery. It included pain medications. It included massage and physical therapy and all of that. And so they asked about, how they felt about their time there. And then they said, now that time has passed, what do you find was the most helpful? And what they got in over 90% of the patients was the meditation practice.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about the loggers and the mill workers. And, these guys would come into the exercise room wearing their bootcut jeans and their great big belt buckles and their cowboy boots. It was really quite charming to see these guys on the exercise bikes. I just encounter one big heart after another.
Wow. So there was this huge culture clash in a way. You translated from one culture to another.
Yeah. And they would admit it, like after we got to be friends and they'd go through the program. And at the end, they'd get together, and it happened several times. They'd say, we really weren't sure about you. But this was good. So, yeah, it bridged the culture clash.
Yeah, it's such a good reminder that these teachings are really only useful to the extent that people can take them on board, kind of with their own kind of way of thinking and experiencing the world in their own sort of context. And
I've experienced your teaching as a student of meditation, and you teach in a very embodied way, and you evoke the body frequently, invite attention to feeling of the air, the clothes. You talk about the importance of balancing, being relaxed and aligned. I'm connecting the dots.
Yes. Yeah. And so that was my experience with mindfulness. And then in 2015, I was introduced to mindful self-compassion. And early on, I read something that Kristin Neff had written, and in her search for things that would be really useful to people and her interest in research, she looked at the research on mindfulness and found some research where people had broken down and said, well, we know mindfulness is very useful, but why is it useful? What are the particular qualities of mindfulness that make it useful? And over, what she found is that it was self-compassion. That was the most useful element of mindfulness. And so that was really a big influence in how she then guided her research to start to study self-compassion. And of course, out of that, the whole program came.
so that piece about in self-compassion, about just paying good, caring attention to oneself, that we also see in mindfulness, although my sense is mindfulness isn't always taught in a way that emphasizes that, especially historically. So it's fascinating to hear that somewhere in some research, it was identified as like, oh, actually what they're learning in this mindfulness that's most helpful to them is that caring attention part.
Yeah. And if you ever teach mindfulness, you'll hear it from your students. Is that they start to have these epiphanies where they start to feel so much more kindly towards themselves.
Certainly fits my experience that I've been around meditation for a whole bunch of years and didn't really have a breakthrough until mindful self-compassion came around. And I was like,
Now the whole thing makes so much more sense.
Yes.
And, within mindful self-compassion, one of the things that I've heard Chris Kermer, he's one of the originators of this, what is now worldwide program. Mm-hmm. He talks about, he uses a phrase, love reveals anything unlike itself. Mm-hmm. And so this is part of what happens when people start to practice mindfulness and they start to practice self-compassion, is they think that what's going to happen, and they hope that what's going to happen is that they're just going to be deeply relaxed. Right, that they're going to be able to become more resilient, that they're going to be able to manage the stressors in their life more effectively. And of course, all of that is true. But the other thing, and I just have a personal suspicion that this is why a lot of people end up not practicing as much as they might like and letting it go, is because these things come up and they don't know how to work with it in mindful self-compassion, in mindfulness or self-compassion, is when you start to go deeper, everything that's not love comes up. And your inner critic, that part of you that's overly critical, that might have a very bad opinion of ourselves, all these different aspects start to arise. And then what do? And so that's been what I feel is a vitally important part of my work with this.
Yeah.
So you're referring to backdraft?
Yes.
And also just that experience, I think if you've just learned a very basic meditation practice or some kind of simple mindfulness intervention, that, there isn't always a lot of direct attention to like, well, what do you do when a whole lot of suffering comes up?
Yeah.
Or a lot of really painful thoughts, like, I'm just supposed to let that thought go and come back to my breath or whatever. Like it feels right. Like there needs to be more than, you have to kind of go digging and find teachers who address that more specifically. And, if you do like a 15-minute like guided thing on YouTube or whatever, it's not going to have that level of nuance and in the training, and then people think, oh, mindfulness isn't for me or whatever. And, it's very, very unfortunate.
Yeah. And sometimes this is called trauma-informed mindfulness, where we really acknowledge that it's such a beautiful thing that these things come up. Because if we know how to work with them, of course, then every time something comes up when we're practicing meditation or self-compassion, then it's a moment of healing. The moment of healing comes when something happens, something comes up. Love has revealed something, and we have the capacity and the knowledge to work with it. Right? Otherwise, it's just another moment of suffering, and it can, exacerbate our low self-esteem. But if we actually know how to meet it, then something good can happen.
And any thoughts? I'm just thinking for our listeners here in particular who are like, yeah, that's what I need. How do I meet it? Any kind of ideas about how does one meet that experience of suffering?
Yes. Okay. So that's such a great question. And I feel like that's exactly at the core, isn't it, of what we're talking about. And so just for a very simple, few-minute response to that, I would say there's 4 qualities that a person can just start to cultivate, start to build like any other skill. And the first one is centeredness, right? And the idea of centeredness is, again, coming back to the body, because when we're in our bodies, we feel more stable, right? And so if we start to feel like, especially the lower part of the body, just simple things like relax our hips, feel our feet. Let our breath come down a little bit further into the abdomen. That those kind of things start to provide a feeling of a foundation of somewhere that we can land. And then the next thing is to move to the spine. And the spine kind of holds when we contact our spine. And even sometimes I suggest to people that they breathe up and down with their spine. And that when they do that, they start to have a sense of the strength, like our spine is bones, right? And we start to have that feeling of, that old expression, get some backbone.
Right, yeah.
That's it. It's like we start to feel this sense of our strength, of our uprightness, of our integrity even. We often contact that when we're physically in contact with the spine. And so we have that center, that sense connection with the earth, connection with the foundation. We have that sense of connection with our uprightness, with our strength through our spine. And then you can move to the heart. And our heart holds our tenderness, right? Our love, our hurt, all of that. So if we just connect with that softness, that tenderness in our heart, and I know our listeners can't see us, but Alex, I know immediately, even when I mentioned that, you touched your heart.
Yes.
Yeah, there's just that natural feeling of just coming to that sense of tenderness. And when we have the centeredness and that sense of our spine, our verticality, when we come to the heart, it's less overwhelming if there's some pain in there at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And then the fourth thing that we can do is just open, like just to provide more space. Because what can happen is as soon as the inner critic is present, as soon as we start to hear those negative voices, we often contract and isolate, right? We tend to feel like we want to hide when the inner critic shows up. And then what happens is that we're separate from our community. We're often separate from our own resources. And so we're less likely to be able to actually work with whatever we're experiencing. And as soon as we start to have a feeling of openness, then we start to feel like there's more and more space. You know, one of my teachers, Tim Olmsted, has said, if you're in your office and a tiger walked in, a Bengal tiger, right, you'd probably be terrified and you'd probably just be trying to figure out, how do I get out of here? Right? But if you're in a football field and across the football field you see that same Bengal tiger, you'd probably just be fascinated. And it's the same with our emotions, is that if we contract around whatever's going on in our heart, it can start to feel very overwhelming, like it's filling all the space. And then we don't have the capacity nearly to the same extent to be able to bring in something else that will be helpful. But if we just start to allow, we're centered, we're grounded, we have our verticality, we have our tenderness, and then we start to open up and have some feeling of space, then we're able to start to bring in some of the resources that we have. And that often surprise us, actually, that we don't even know we have.
So then bringing our awareness to a sort of a sensory experience of how we are supported, how we are solid, how there is space, in addition to holding in awareness a difficult issue, or in connection with.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe it.
Would you like to say more about being relaxed and aligned? I think it's also the title of a book.
Oh, is it?
Oh, yes, I think it is, by Shambhala Publications. Yeah. Oh,
right. Oh my gosh.
You've hit on it on your own.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah. Well, the idea is that often when we're meditating or when we're addressing some sort of pain we have, whether it's physical or emotional, is it really helps to be in a certain state, including a certain kind of physical state, right? And if we're very slumped, if we're very tight, any of those things, we start to feel less resourceful, right? Like even if a listener, if you wanted to try it at home right now, you notice that if your body collapses, pretty soon your mind collapses, right? And our mind is highly patterned. It's highly patterned. What it loves to do, what it looks for first, is things that are similar to what we're experiencing. So that means if we're in a painful state or if we're somewhat collapsed or contracted, our mind will actually do something that is trying to be helpful, but is not so helpful, which is it will start to bring other experiences where we were in the same space, right? So if we're collapsed, it'll bring us memories of all the times that we were sad, of all the times when we felt helpless or hopeless. And if we're tense, it will start to bring us those kinds of experiences. So one thing we can do is just by starting to change our posture. And so often we're told that it's good to relax. We all know this, right? We all want this, is to relax. But if you just tell somebody or you tell yourself that you should relax, not so helpful, right?
The inner critic.
The inner critic, exactly. It's like, oh, I should relax. And then we just get tighter. But what we can do is we can, instead of giving ourselves an order like that, is give ourselves some gentle suggestions, right? Invitations. And so it's in the spirit of an invitation, right? So we invite our hips to relax. Our hips are one of the biggest muscles in the body. are some of the biggest, and they're low in the body. And both of those things really help, right? So you just start to relax your hips, right? You just start to feel your feet on the ground. And often just by feeling our feet on the ground, there's a natural start to relaxation.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So we don't just go into, I should relax, I have to relax, body relax. It's more, okay, I'm just going to feel my feet on the ground. I'm going to feel my feet just touch the ground.
I also have this experience when I do that my awareness becomes more complete. Like if I'm just stuck in my head or saying I should relax, it's like that head's floating above the body phenomena, like there's not really connected, all my energy is kind of up here around my head. And when I start to have a cue, like, relax the hips or put the feet on the ground, then the whole sense of like one's being expands to be more full bodied, because you have to go all the way down there, to your feet, with your attention.
Miles away from the clouds that are heads
right, yeah.
What you're saying also reminds me of the idea of power postures, that by changing our postures or using gestures that we can also change our mind state.
Mm-hmm.
When I stretch or do Egoscue exercises, a sense of agency arises.
It just arises very naturally.
From the physical relaxation and posture. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And so the other thing we want that relaxation. So that's one of the ways we can do it. Just giving ourselves those gentle curiosity. I wonder what it would be like if my knees just relaxed 1%.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it starts to provide us a good base. And then, of course, if those areas start to relax, then everything else is built on top of those, right? And so then the spine starts to feel like it can come up straighter, and that's where our sense of alignment comes in, right? Because we want to be relaxed, but we don't just want to be a puddle. We also want to feel our aliveness, our connection with the world, our sense of uprightness, right? Someone commented to me recently, I thought this was so beautiful. She said, most animals, they're on fours, and so their hearts are facing the ground. Mm-hmm. We're upright, and so our hearts are facing each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can just start to titrate. So if we focus on relaxation too long, we can start to get into that I should. But if we just focus for a moment on relaxation, maybe the bottoms of the feet, that contact with the ground, and then the sense of alignment, the sense of the uprightness of the spine, and then the sense of the hips, and the hips just relaxing and letting go a little bit. And then coming back to that sense of uprightness. And so we're titrating, we're moving back and forth between the two. And in doing that, pretty soon we start to realize we feel a little different.
I do. Right now. I think
Me too.
Yeah, you too, right. You've guided us to this place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I bet your therapy patients benefit a lot from this skill. Just in conversation, you can guide people to it.
Oh, they do. Yeah.
So the body being relaxed and aligned corresponds to the mind being relaxed, aligned, the person being.
It seems to, yes.
Right.
Yeah, that's what people report. They can concentrate better. They feel more relaxed. They feel more in contact with what's really important to them. Because with stress, we're often just doing one thing after another. We kind of lose track of what it is we really want to be doing.
It reminds me of the meditation instruction that says to sort of cultivate a state of relaxed alertness. That you're not, as you're saying, you're not just like a puddle, or like getting drifty and sleepy, although that happens at times, but that there's something about the relaxation and the alertness or the alignment, as you're describing it in the body, sort of together, that creates a kind of presence, but with that sort of grounded, relaxed sort of quality to it.
Yeah.
Also reminds me of parts work in the sense that there aren't parts at odds with each other. There isn't this inner civil war. between parts that are resisting certain things, parts that are want certain things. So there isn't all this extra energy being wasted or extra resource being wasted on inner conflict. There's alignment with values, and there's relaxation, and no unnecessary, no waste of energy and life force. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I would say that parts work is a primary aspect of the work that I do with people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that when we start to turn that mindfulness and self-compassion towards the different parts of ourselves, it's so healing.
Wow. One of our previous guests, Daniel Ellenberg, he uses the term selves-compassion, selves-forgiveness, selves-acceptance.
Nice.
It really captures that.
Yeah.
You're clearly also having a trauma-informed approach. So that's part and parcel of the parts work and the embodied work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about that, because, working with the body can be so fraught when there's trauma. On the one hand, very helpful. On the other hand, very triggering for some especially different cues, different parts of the body. Any thoughts on sort of an on-ramp there for that kind of work for people where that's a challenge?
Well, the first thing is that we really bring in our self-compassion towards that, because it's one of those places where the slower we go, the more quickly we start to see results. Mm-hmm. That, our inner critic often says, hurry up, you're behind, get with it, you should be over this by now, all those kind of things. Mm-hmm. And so a really important on-ramp is just that idea of starting to cultivate that self-compassion. And so that we can meet that inner critic. And often when the inner critic is there, there's three parts there, right? One is the adult, which we sometimes are not identified with in those moments. Mm-hmm. But the other part is the child. Mm-hmm. Right. So there's the inner critic that seems very harsh and is, for those of your listeners who might not be very familiar with that, the inner critic is often the voices of old authority figures, right? Parental voices, voices of our culture, of our religion, different things like that. And it's become toxic so often, right? And it's just... it sounds like if you do well enough, then you'll get my approval. Mm-hmm. But actually, it just finds something else to criticize.
Right.
And so originally it was developed because the child was trying to understand what would allow them to get the love they wanted. Mm-hmm. Right. And so they heard their parents say, oh, they value this. So they thought, okay, so internally, I'll take that on. Mm-hmm. And I'll try to become that. I'll have this voice inside my head that sounds like my father that continually reminds me to measure up and measure up, right? Mm-hmm. So when the inner critic is there, this beautiful, tender little child is there, right? And Chris Germer has really started talking about shame, and that shame is the most innocent emotion. Because shame is based so much in our desire to be loved, this natural human desire to be loved. Mm-hmm. And so here's the inner critic saying, this is how you be lovable. Better measure up. And here's a child thinking, okay, who I am is not enough. Mm-hmm. Right. And so if we start to, again, in answer to your question about the on-ramp, is we start to bring some just real tenderness, kindness, our strength that comes with our compassion and our love. When we start to bring those qualities, and then we start to recognize, because the inner critic works best in the dark. It's just behind our ear or just somewhere where we're just not quite fully conscious of what it's saying, but we're reacting and our body is reacting to what the inner critic is saying. And so when we start to turn towards it, do you remember that scene in The Wizard of Oz where there's a big and powerful Oz and everybody is just quaking and so terrified. And then little Toto, the little dog, goes over to this curtain on this booth and pulls the curtain back. And suddenly the great and powerful Oz is revealed as this little guy
That's right.
operating a machine, right? And our inner critic is somewhat like that, is that it feels like that great, powerful thing. And when we start to turn towards it, we realize like, wow, you're really mean. I would never allow you to talk to my friend like that. Or my child, I would never consciously invite you into my home. And so we start to be able to change the power differential. So instead of the power being with the inner critic, the power is with ourselves, our wise, kind selves. And then we can start to relate to that little child very, very differently.
So there's a link between trauma, inner critic dynamics, the extent to which people can feel connected to their bodies, their embodied experience.
Yeah.
I find that curious. I'm just connecting the dots for myself.
Yeah. Because otherwise what can happen in the body is that if we're not consciously aware of the demands of the inner critic and the needs of the child, we feel it in the body.
Right. And the critic, that energy has been it's been so internalized from such a young age that it's barely even verbal. Like it's just a press or like a sense or like it's just there in the room, kind of crossing its arms or something and like creating a vibe. It's not always something verbal that you could point to and say, oh, there's a thought, like to, deconstruct or whatever. Like it's often, as you're saying, like it's sort of just below our awareness, kind of just outside, but really influencing what's going on. I also think your comments on pacing were really useful and important when we're talking about trauma too. Just, that this is going to heal in its own time, and that as much as the critic says you should be over this or move on or whatever, that, being able to slow down and take this at the pace that it's going to happen, to have some acceptance of that process.
Yeah. And we start to really question that idea of the inner critic and that truth, supposedly, of the inner critic that says we'll be a better person or we'll be more worthy once we're at a certain level of healing. Ironically, the healing being getting rid of the inner critic. But instead, we start to really feel, the voice of self-compassion. And again, really feel in the body what it's like when that voice of compassion starts to be stronger than the voice of the inner critic.
I've been very much struggling with, you're behind, hurry up.
Yeah.
And I didn't even know that was the inner critic.
Yeah. It's the inner critic, one way that we can identify it is not always from the words, because sometimes we are behind.
Okay,
and,
right.
Sometimes we do want to pick up the pace. Exactly. It's no problem, But it becomes a problem when the inner critic starts to take over and we can hear a difference in tone. Right. It's just like Kate was saying, it's not necessarily even the words, but just the feeling, the press. It can come out in the tone that we speak to ourselves in. And that's when we start to realize, oh, the inner critic has gotten hold of this.
So an observation that's objectively, sort of journalistically correct.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
It's like, oh gosh, yeah, I better get going here.
It reminds me of how like pharmaceutical companies like latch on to like one good finding in a clinical trial or something, and then they make a whole lot of hay out of it or something like that. It's like the critic gets like one little bit of information or data or, something that has some quasi truth to it or has some objective truth as we're saying, but then it kind of like amps it up and makes it bigger or.
Yeah.
So hence the value of sensing the larger self, getting the larger perspective, the full picture.
Yeah.
Right. That fact may be true, but is that really the correct perspective? Wow.
we know that you do a lot of teaching of self-compassion and mindfulness. And just curious, what are some of the challenges that you see come up when you introduce these, or, some of the somatic approaches as well, or your work with folks with pain? Where are some of those first kind of obstacles or challenges that get in the way for folks? Maybe we can help get rid of some obstacles for our listeners.
Sure. Well, after the inner critic, which often comes up really early on, is a feeling, sometimes people can feel really overwhelmed. That's a report I get, is either overwhelmed by physical pain or by emotional pain. And that sense of overwhelm can really stop them. And they have a tendency then, or I should definitely include myself in this, is that then we have a tendency to go back into the old things that helped us feel a little better, even if we feel that they're not the healthiest thing we could be doing. And so there's those things. There's the momentum towards the old stuff. There's the pain itself that can feel overwhelming. And so, after we've addressed the inner critic, and often then we're addressing the overwhelm of pain. And so one of the ways we do that is what we talked about a little earlier with that sense of the tiger. And to help people recognize when they're contracting, and to just invite them to start to practice. And often we practice in those moments where we have less intensity going on. There was that old phrase, strike while the iron is hot. And we want to do just the opposite. We want to strike while the iron is cold. And so we just start to practice, taking a breath, taking an extra moment, bringing something to consciousness instead of going with the old momentum. And just like every other skill we're learning, it's so much easier if we start in those simpler moments. So something on that 1 to 10 scale that's more like a 2 or a 3 rather than a 7 or an 8. And that gradually we build those skills, and so that we can meet more and more intense experiences. And often what we realize is that we're surprised when we get to the high ones that we've already accomplished so much. And so I would say overwhelm. Another one is that often if somebody has something like pain in the body, say like the people I used to work with at the clinic, were injured often on the job. And often the way they were injured had to do with something that was not well in place for them. So in other words, it was somebody else's fault. Essentially, it was a boss that was putting too much pressure on them. I would hear that story over and over again. Or a machine that wasn't properly maintained, or something like that. And of course, outside of that circumstance, people get in car accidents, or sometimes it's aging, which isn't something they did, but something that just happens to all of us. And so we have an anger, right? And so we're angry at what happened to us, or just being in pain all the time, whether it's just a pain of stress or a physical pain. Anger can come along with that. And anger is the politically incorrect emotion, right?
Right.
That people feel sympathy when somebody is grieving, or if somebody says they're sad, or, if somebody says they're anxious or tense, we can all relate to that. But if somebody says they're angry, often many of us are a little bit afraid of
I'm out of here.
the fire, right? And the power of anger. And actually, that force of anger, if there's a place where it can be met, actually becomes a stronger aliveness, a more life force, more vibrance. When it gets integrated, it becomes better boundaries, which people who are going through painful things, whether it's temporary or long-term, really need. And so one of the things that I actually love is having the opportunity to work with anger. Because, right, you can sense that aliveness in there. That's underneath anger. And so, and then the opposite of that, of course, is that if we feel angry and we feel that it's wrong, that we should be forgiving, that we should be more calm, whatever it is, it takes a lot of energy to hold that in. Right. We start to call that sort of tension in the body armoring. Right. And that when we can acknowledge the anger and say, oh, welcome. So glad to meet you. And have a space where anything goes. And so I always feel that in session when I start to work with someone, it's one of the first things I say. All the parts of you that are involved with this are deeply welcome here. And so the person may feel it's too much for me. I don't know how to deal with anger. It really does feel like a Bengal tiger to most of us.
Becoming one, maybe.
Becoming one, yes. And that when we can say, oh, welcome, welcome. I know you make sense. I know there's something there. I really want to know. And we start to allow some space for voices to raise if that's what happens, or some expression in the body of anger, that the person starts to integrate that fire, that aliveness, and good things happen. And so that's another piece, is just that sense, everything is welcome here. Yeah.
Because we are so not taught that, especially around anger, I think, at least as women. Right. So to have some space, as you're saying, like with a therapist or inside just within yourself, where you can welcome that and be with that energy and that experience and explore it, feels just really healing and useful.
Yeah.
But then I've also come across the idea that the near enemy of anger is hostility. The way I understand it, and this is also from Kristen Neff and Chris Germer, that we can confuse anger with hostility. So anger at someone versus the energy of anger more related to our needs and how we can rationally get our needs met, as opposed to attacking the messenger or the obstacle in front of us. That's how I understand it.
It's beautiful. It's beautifully put. And yes, hostility is very different, has a very different quality. If you just let yourself feel hostility a little bit, you notice that it's very cold. Doesn't it feel a little like cold metal?
I always think a little bit cold and slightly slimy.
Slimy, yeah. Yeah. And then you think of anger, and there's warmth and aliveness and fire.
Because hostility is closed-hearted, perhaps.
Hostility is, yeah. And again, everything is welcome, right? And so if you give a person a chance to speak about hostility, hatred, which is just right in there in the same suburb as hostility, is you start to realize often that underneath that is a very vulnerable, that hurt child. Right, who has felt so mistreated. And then that's really workable.
I really like your analogy of cooling the iron. Been watching some documentaries about the Iron Age and watching ironsmiths work. And it's interesting how there are times when they heat the iron and then there are times when they cool it. Because depending on what you want to do, like bend or hammer, you want it to be at the right temperature. That really fits the self-compassion concept, I think.
Yeah.
You want it to be at the workable temperature for whatever purpose you have.
That's really what we're talking about here, isn't it? Yeah. How to create that space where we've created a workable temperature. Yeah.
Like you may think, it should be just completely molten, but not necessarily. So working with anger, that sounds tricky. And it's also it's so sticky as an emotion. Depending on models we've seen growing up, it's easy to be hostile and not realize that that's not going to move things forward.
Yeah. Anger is the hardest thing is all of the different things that are holding it in, right? So somebody starts to consider that possibility that their anger is not as bad as they thought it might be, that they have to go through the layers, because often people feel like they feel this anger inside of themselves. And sometimes it feels like rage. You know, like even a small child who repeatedly is treated in a way that doesn't feel good. Something in them says, no, this isn't right. And there can be a real feeling of a rage, but also a sense that they've never seen a positive expression of this. Right? They don't know what to do. This energy feels so big that what I've heard so many times is, I feel that if I let my anger out, it would destroy the world. And so really, it's not the anger itself that's the issue when we begin to work with it. It's the fact that there's so many layers on top of it that say, don't feel this, this is wrong, this is bad, so on. So all those messages from all those different places that have created this real armoring around it. Because once people actually start to work with the anger, they realize it's mixed with grief. It's mixed with their own sense of their own goodness, that's so much what they're fighting for, is for that to be acknowledged and seen and felt by others, and, you know, given back to them through gaze and touch. But getting to it can be a challenge. A beautiful challenge.
And as you're saying, we just have so few good role models in that area that often we come into adulthood just thinking like anger's unsafe, or anger's risky, or just plain inconvenient, or it's going to push people away, or whatever. So there's not a lot of good messaging. So there's a lot of figuring that out for ourselves. I think many of us do in adulthood. Well, I think we're getting close to wrap-up time. Maybe I'll dive into our final sort of question for you, which is, if people are interested in learning more about you, your work, studying with you, anything like that, where can they find you? How can they learn more?
Well, probably the best thing, I actually don't have a website, and I'm not on social media.
They can go to our show notes page.
Oh, that's perfect.
Yeah.
By all means, they should do that. And look at all the other beautiful podcasts you have. I listened to some, and they were fabulous. Probably the best thing would be an email address that I can give to you now.
Great.
And it is rjaffereports@gmail.com.
Great. Excellent. Thanks so much, Rochelle. It's been a great conversation, and we will definitely share your info on the show notes page.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening today.
If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you'll hit subscribe, leave us a great rating or review, and spread the word. You can also go to noblemindpodcast.com to join our email list. You'll get a weekly behind-the-scenes message, news, announcements, and other special goodies we come up with just for you. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.